Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us for the second in our Newcastle Youth Studies Network online seminar series, which is quite a mouthful. This one that is on the topic of young people, cultural practice and wellbeing. And we have speakers from Griffith University that are going to do two separate papers. And also we have a speaker from Finland, like we did in the last one as well. So it seems like we have some good connections with Finland, which is great. So we're going to start off with Andy, Nesta and Ben from Griffith University, who are going to be talking about youth, music making and wellbeing during a public health crisis.
Okay,
so
thanks.
There you go. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Steve. Yeah, so our presentation is based on some research that we're currently doing, and obviously the kind of rationale of it is to look at the relationship between young people, music and wellbeing during this crisis. COVID-19 being in a global context, the worst public health crisis that the world has faced for 100 years. So lockdowns and social distancing have impacted all social groups, and as we all know, there's been widespread expressed experience of alienation and meaninglessness, to use a classic sociological term. And our project is focused on 18 to 35-year-old music makers, really to look at the sort of classical definition of youth in the contemporary era, and to examine the value of music as a source of well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. Going into this project, we did a survey of the literature just to see what was out there in terms of work on young people and music and crisis. Nesta, if you could flip to the next slide, please. And what we found was, and I've mucked this up because the order is wrong, and Nesta, you can go next, please.
So, thanks, Andy. So it's very important to define what do we mean by well-being for our study. So as you might know, well-being is a very nuanced and multifaceted concept which stems from multiple aspects of life, and therefore is quite difficult to define. And not surprisingly, to date, there's no one agreed definition of well-being. There are many definitions available in the literature, and they do vary by discipline. I will not go into those today, but I would like to highlight a couple that are useful for our study. A useful definition is that it captures a sense of having what you need for life to be good, and captures a mixture of people's life circumstances and how they feel and function. The second definition that you can see here is the World Health Organization definition of health, that defines it as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So this definition is holistic in nature and tells us a bit more about the dimensions or components to consider when we talk about well-being in relation to health. This definition also implies that absence of disease does not necessarily guarantee health or equate with health, and therefore it's important to attend to well-being. So traditionally, most definitions are driven by descriptions and dimensions of well-being that often result in relatively static assessment and understanding of well-being, limiting our ability to understand the fluid and dynamic nature of the concept. So more recently, the concept of relational well-being has emerged, which regards well-being as an active and dynamic concept constituted through the interaction between individual, social and environmental processes at a particular time and place, making it particularly useful construct to consider for our specific, for this study that we are doing. So grounded in interpretivist tradition of social science, it approaches people as subjects rather than objects who are formed within specific social and cultural contexts, with the aim to understand the ways they see the world and what well-being means to them in as close terms to them as possible. So in summary, in our study, we recognize well-being as a holistic, multifaceted, and dynamic concept. We also recognize that well-being of individuals and populations can be formed and shaped by a specific social and cultural environment or a context. So in our study, we're looking at the context of the public health crisis that is a global pandemic that we're experiencing today.
Okay, so moving now on to the literature. There is a literature out there on youth and music and crisis. and we've surveyed that in some depth. But what we've found is that the literature focuses primarily on issues such as war, refugeeism, and ecological disasters. There isn't right at the moment much at all on public health crises, including the current pandemic. Studies focusing on the role of music in youth resilience to crisis, and crisis in a broadly defined way, have emphasised the value of structured interventions such as music therapy, psychological support, including creative work such as music video projects. And our project goes in a different direction. It's looking at kind of young people's unstructured and unsupported uses of music in a more sort of DIY context.
Okay, so a little bit about methods and how we collected the data and how we analyzed it. So we conducted online semi-structured interviews. Clearly online is the method to use these days because of social distancing measures that are in place. To date, we interviewed 12 people. And as Andy mentioned earlier, the eligibility criteria for the study was the young age that we define as 18 to 35 years. We focused on music makers, which includes any music makers such as solo musician, band players, DJs, or other, and at any level, so be it amateur, semi-professional, or professional, and clearly that's self-identified. Participants were recruited based on their characteristics, so being music makers and young age, and based on convenience sampling. We used various strategies to recruit participants, such as university's broadcast email that calls for volunteers, call outs on social media, and also via gatekeepers of organizations that are involved in local music making scenes. Thematic analysis was used to do the preliminary analysis of the data that we're presenting today. And of course, study is approved by university's research ethics committee. On this slide, you can see some of the key participant characteristics. So as you can see, we have a nice gender balance. So we have 6 females, 6 males. Mean age is about 25 years. Most of our participants were Australian. Most reside in Queensland, where we are. In terms of employment, 6 participants mentioned that they are students. 1 participant was unemployed, and other participants work part of full-time or a combination. In terms of music level, we also have a nice spread. So you can see we have professional musicians, semi-professionals, amateurs, and 1 participant indicating he's studying to become a professional musician. Music making type, we have people who play instruments, several singers and songwriters, and the remaining participants engage in multiple activities. So they are writing songs, they're singers, and play instruments. In terms of live performance frequency, participants range from not recently to 5 times per week. Again, quite a nice spread of diversity of participants. In terms of impact of music, of COVID-19 on music making activity, some participants indicated the activity increased. Half participants said it decreased, and others were neutral or had mixed feelings about it. Career impacts, some participants viewed that it may be a positive impact, some felt it was negative, others felt it was neutral, and the remaining 2 did not comment on that. So, and the final 2, as we focus on understanding what music making means in terms of well-being. So all participants, as you can see here, mentioned that it contributes to their well-being as well as social connectedness. Okay, now on to you, Ben, to discuss our preliminary findings.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to delve into some of those preliminary findings that began to be indicated there with the quantitative data. So if you can take me to the next slide, please, Anesta. Yes, so firstly, unsurprisingly, COVID-19 had a major impact on the lives of everyone we've spoken to. A foremost concern for most people was the loss of income and jobs. That included music work and non-music work, casual work in hospitality and retail, redundancies in office jobs. And as many musicians have what we call portfolio careers, there was a mixture of impacts. And that happened alongside and in connection with mental health impacts. a good number of people spoke about having the biggest challenges they've faced in that department. And so the way these things are connected is summed up here by Emma, who's a pop singer, who told me she had a full booking of live performances, which is her source of income, for the rest of the year. And she says, I went from being a very booked and blessed artist to absolutely nothing in 24 to 48 hours. That's a story I heard a few times. So that takes a huge toll on your mental health. Not only do I identify as an artist and I love singing and performing, there's that added financial stress as well. So here we see the connection between both work and passion and identity for these people. Moving on to the specific impact on music making itself, the biggest change was the loss of live performance. Most of the people we spoke to saw music making as a public and a social activity. Suddenly it became a domestic and private activity. Some people had less time for music because they got non-music related work or caring obligations. Most people actually had more time, yet there was this other ingredient of needing to have motivation. And so here's an example of Kelly, a songwriter, who told me that in the past, she's often turned to songwriting as a way of coping with life. She says, in recent times, I've tried to turn to it and it hasn't been as successful. But when I have been able to get in the mind space to write music that I resonate with and that I'm proud of, it's been really rewarding. And so there's that paradox of people saying, I know that music making is good for me. I know that this is where I find my happiness, yet I need to have the motivation. I need to be in the right headspace. It's not just a rote task that can be done. It's not just a job. There's this almost, romantic idea of what art is and the place that it has in your life. So moving on to what music making offers as a source of well-being, that continues on that theme. As Ernesta said, everyone identified music making as a source of well-being. Some of the themes that came out of that were, what does it offer? It offers identity and purpose. Who am I? I'm a musician. What am I doing? What am I working towards? What am I achieving? It's a source of social connection, a big part of the social lives and social networks of people, but also a means of connecting with friends and family outside of music, as well as the special relationships of band members and collaborators and scenes. Music offers, just coming back to the previous point, music offers focus and routine. So music making stood out as something that is both mentally and physically absorbing. People would lose themselves in playing music. They would lose time, and that was a pleasurable, that was a good thing. That was something that people needed and wanted. And music making was seen as a way of working with feelings and expressing feelings, among other things. So that's where we can go on to the next slide. Thanks, just to delve into those couple of points. So Aria is someone who told me that songwriting and music making for her is a way of expressing herself. When she was young, she had trouble expressing herself. She wasn't the only one to say that. And she wasn't the only one to say that music making became a way of expressing herself. It's continued to be that, but it's also become a way for her to see what's going on in her own head. She said that sitting down with a blank piece of paper and a pen is a way to monitor my inner environment. So there we see expression, but also, self, this sort of reflexivity as a part of that. And in terms of working with feelings, there were kind of two sides to this. One is the obvious side of wanting to play or write hopeful and positive songs. Some people saw a duty or a service in that. Daniel is someone who's a classical pianist who said that he pulled himself, or when he emerged from a very heavy depression, he began playing songs that were dear to him, that had hopeful and positive lyrics, but he also found comfort in playing sad songs to get his feelings out. And he spoke about the physical effects of the chill up the spine and the inner warmth. Emma is also a songwriter who spoke about sitting down and playing things on the piano or guitar and crying, and that was a good thing. That was cathartic. She also was one of a few people, but she put it the most poetically. She spoke about writing songs during this time that'll never see the light of day. She won't show anyone else, but they said things like, basically, COVID is shit, to quote her exactly. So that's an example of people using music making as a private way of working with feelings. And maybe slightly different from music listening, though some parallels. Turning to the strategies and lessons coming out of this time, a big one is online music making. Probably a lot of people are familiar with the fact that there's been online live performances by big acts. That goes right down to the small and local level. One woman I interviewed in Geelong, Victoria, has been organising a virtual venue in Geelong quite successfully. But this has had mixed responses. No one's really completely happy with it. And musicians like John, who's from an internationally touring band, he spoke about what was lacking, the connection that was lacking in these online performances. So it doesn't completely fill the gap, but it is something. Moving on to the broader online setting, it was actually a way for the music making community to support each other. So one thing I heard again and again is this idea that the playing field has been leveled, that more senior and established musicians are in it together with less established musicians, and they're helping each other. And there's this sense that artists are willing to connect with each other, they're willing to help each other and collaborate, and they're using social media, especially Facebook groups, as well as Instagram to do these things. And the final point we wanted to mention is the perspective people are getting from this, the way they see the future. The biggest thing was a sense of a lack of control over the present and the future. Some people were prepared for this. Like Kelly quoted here says, "When I became a musician, that's what I signed up for." Donnie, on the other hand, says, "I thought I was bulletproof. COVID put a hole in that for me." But there's also this sense of gratitude. Emma, quoted there at the bottom, says, "I'll never take a gig for granted again." That's a common thing. She's one of some people who's told us that they're not going to rely on music as their income in the future, yet they're going to continue making music. And perhaps to conclude this section, some of the points that we've been through might be a way of understanding why people would want to do that. So I'll hand over to Andy to wrap things up.
Thanks, Ben. So in terms of reflections then, I think what we've taken from this research so far, bearing in mind that it is ongoing, music making has been a strong form of individual and collective support during COVID-19. And to be fair, there hasn't been much official kind of recognition about that in the news. The news has been focused on other demographics, and youth has been sidelined as this thing that is problematic because it wants to have house parties and get into sort of public space and all of that kind of thing. So it's been good in terms of getting a grip on how music has been helping young people in that respect. And we've also noted, as the data shows, that the crisis has influenced people to reflect in different ways on the value of creativity in their lives. We're not going to put music in a box and try and separate it from a creative passion that young people have overall. So they talked about writing songs, which means writing lyrics, which means taking the kind of energy to think about what the epidemic is doing in their lives and how they need to express that through song. Young people have proactively used music as an enabling resource during COVID, typically, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, in a very DIY fashion. And I think there is always this kind of assumption that you need to organize workshops or you need to do something to bring people together. But actually, what we've found is that music has had this kind of self-therapeutic sort of aspect to it as well. And young people obviously want to be heard. The people who've come to us, it's a self-selected sample. You know, they want an opportunity to have their personal story, music's meaning during the COVID-19 crisis known, to tell somebody about it. So moving on now to some very brief conclusions. This is an interesting snapshot on how things might progress in the future. Inesta sent me a very interesting thing this morning about a new, or not a new platform called Song Trader, where people can sort of connect with other people online who might be interested in working with them to develop their music, to sort of send it in the direction of film directors and documentary makers. The COVID-19 experience, it's brought about new ways of engagement with music, even as simple as doing online performances, and we have plus and minus kind of evaluations of that format, but it is nevertheless a reality of the virus. Finally, as post-digital, post-risk generation, the 18 to 35 year old age group, they're highly vulnerable to a whole range of things, including kind of elongated transitions, precarious living, and so on. And I think what we found through the results here is that COVID, crippling though it might have been, is in some ways just another kind of, you know, incident on that pathway to sort of risky and vulnerable lifestyles. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy and Esther and Ben. That was really great. And also importantly, very much on time. That was really good. Thanks, guys. Just under the 20. So I sort of mentioned at the start that if you have any questions, can you please put them on the chat, and I'll read them there. So, and we'll ask a question at the end of each presentation and then have a kind of broader discussion at the end. So we do have one question now from Julia Cook. If you want to open the chat, everyone will be able to see that. But basically, as Julia points out, that some of your findings resonate with some of the work that me, Dave, Furuja, Julia Cook and Julia Coffey have been doing in Newcastle about hospo work, where it seems the kind of effects of, you know, work shutting down and how heavy that is felt, I suppose, correlates to pre-existing inequalities or privileges. So I'm just wondering there, you know, and Julia's asking if, you know, those that got to experience the shutdown has been able to make an album or whatever, whether there was, you know, sociological demographics that I suppose mediated the possibility of doing that, as opposed to maybe experiencing it much more risky and intense. Do you have any data on that? Yeah.
Ben, did you pick up any of that in your data analysis?
There were certainly personal differences, like I said, about the time people had, but it was interesting. A lot of the chat tended to focus more around the emotional resources, and I was looking for, you know, material difference in terms of who can have the space and equipment to play and record at home, but we did have a pretty diverse group of people so far, and we're still going. And I haven't I found more a sense of, you do what you've got to do to make this happen. You scrape what you have to be able to play music. One thing that I did find common across everyone is that every one of these young people learnt to play music through their childhood. So there's an interesting sort of resource that they all have, I guess. And there's a mix of backgrounds there, but they all have that in common. So I wonder if that's something that, in terms of an intangible resource, that they have to turn to. But perhaps not enough data to look at broader material patterns. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so like something maybe like their housing arrangements, you know, having freedom to kind of have your own room, as opposed to maybe if they were bringing up kids or stuff like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move on to the next one. But as I said, anyone that has any questions, please fill up the chat with those, and I'll try and use those throughout towards the end of the discussion, and we can bring all the participants in for that. So now we're going to move on to our second speaker, which is Adele Pavlidis, also from Griffith University. And she's going to talk about her work around roller derby, and the title of the paper is called Troubled Derby Subjectivities, Sport Cultures as Cure and Cause. Thanks, Adele. You need to unmute yourself as well.
Yeah, I need to unmute myself first. So, okay. Am I still sharing my screen?
No.
No, okay. And here we go. Okay.
Yep. that's it.
All right. Okay, thank you. So I first wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm working and living, which is the Yamimba and Kumbaberi people of the Gold Coast. And thank you for the opportunity to present this new work around the theme of youth cultures and wellbeing. These are ideas that I've been working with and thinking about for a long time now, and I'm looking forward to getting some feedback and input as I develop the paper further. My name is Adele Pavlidis, for those that don't know me, and I'm a research fellow with the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research. I'm currently working on an Australian Research Council funded fellowship about the rise of contact sports for women and the ways both sport and gender relations are changing. The main sports I'm focused on are Australian rules football and roller derby, but also sport more generally. The paper I'm presenting today focuses on women who have left the sport of roller derby, as I believe this provides a unique insight into the dynamics of the sport and both the potential and problems it has for well-being. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where sport fits in relation to youth cultures. Here on the slide, I've got a few key points in terms of the social benefits of two examples, sport and music. There's plenty of research by some eminent scholars, some here today, of the important role that youth cultures play in providing young people and young adults with a community and a sense of belonging, and an identity and a space outside of the home and work where they can feel competent. It's clear that there are important relationships between youth cultures and leisure practices and well-being. However, as it stands, this relationship has been theorised often as gender blind and has also not taken into account critiques of neoliberalism and positivity. This is key to my paper today as I argue that gender relations, material practices and culture are important keystones in well-being, and further that sports such as roller derby might be key disruptors, providing a space for transformation and a shift from embodied distress to strength and confidence. Unlike music, sport cultures, besides video games, which I'll bracket out, also provide a physical aspect, which could include muscle building, cardio fitness, and so on, which shift hormonal, chemical, and biological flows. Government invests millions of dollars per year in sport as a key site for mental and physical health, and we're instructed to meet daily and weekly targets for physical activity. And yet, sport is not all good. Most clearly, sport is a site of sexism, as it has been and continues to be a site of gender segregation, the acceptance of boys will be boys, rape culture, violence, both on and off the field, not to mention bullying and other forms of exclusion. And I think it's important to note here that despite governmental claims of sport being good, we see problems from the grassroots level all the way to elite and professional levels. At the heart of these problems, from my perspective, is an issue of governance. There's an acceptance of a masculine model of governance with the heroic leader, aka the CEO, taking charge. And along came roller derby, set to shake up the foundation of sport. This was a women-centered sport, but unlike sports such as netball and gymnastics in many ways. It's a sport with a unique athlete-led governance system where the mantra, by the skater, for the skater, forms an important ethos in the way things are done. It's a sport that has resisted incorporation by national and international governing bodies and has insisted in doing things their own way. Because of its unique athlete-led governing formation, roller derby has innovated in terms of gender-inclusive policies and has been responsive to issues of racism within the organisation. There's much more to say about these aspects, but it's not the focus of today's paper. My point is that roller derby provided something quite starkly different on the sport landscape, combining elements of youth cultures with the physicality of team contact sports, predominantly for women. Since 2010, there's been a growing body of work focusing on roller derby as a novel and potentially important space of gender equity. This is just a small selection of ideas that myself and others have been working through in relation to the sport, but it is an overview of the areas of focus, including gender relations, femininity and feminism, masculinities, governance, and though not directly, well-being. The paper I'm presenting today takes this a step further and puts a well-being lens onto roller derby. I believe this is a significant step in understanding the relationship between the intense physicality of a sport like roller derby, the aesthetics and style of youth cultures, issues related to governance and the formations of groups, and gender relations, and how this assemblage contributes to people's well-being, both within the sport and beyond. So feedback from one of the external assessors on the fellowship application suggested it would be useful to not only interview current sport participants, but also those who had dropped out / quit / decided to leave. I thought this would provide some interesting insights into the enabling and impeding relations in roller derby and put out a call for participants. I was overwhelmed by the positive response. Just a week or so after the call went out, COVID lockdown came into place together with juggling homeschooling and academic work. Hence, all interviews were either via video call or telephone. This was surprisingly positive as it created a space for participants to explain what attracted to them and to tell the story of what happened so that where they eventually left the sport. In total, I conducted 12 in-depth interviews with people from all over Australia, including WA, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Canberra, and New South Wales, and one from the USA. Together with the overarching feminist new materialist framework, I draw on a post-qualitative methodology, which engages with critiques of representation. That is, I question the idea that as a sociologist, I go out and I discover realities. Instead, a post-qualitative methodology purports that we are co-creating knowledge, generating data, whether in the form of sociological writing, poetic forms, prose, visual, and so on. I'm going to go through some of the data to give you a sense of the life worlds of the Derby participants as they're reflected back in the interviews. These are partial and fragments, but will give you an overall sense of the data. So participant 1 found the DIY punk aggressive culture what attracted her, but the politics became too intense. In particular, the emphasis on risk and safety became a detractor for her. The risky and aggressive elements were central to the fun of the culture and feelings of belonging, and yet she felt this was complicated by people being triggered. She called herself a functional alcoholic and described her body at the time as, I quote, a temple that was leased out to demons. She said she was winning at the after party. Participant 2 talked about the physiological benefits of skating and was excited that so many women were gaining access to this physical practice, which she understood as protective against joint injury through building strong core muscles. However, again, issues of politics and governance affected participation in the sport. She stated, a desire to win can overrule a desire to be better. She noted that a key issue for her was that although the sport started off as what she called deviant, it eventually fell in line with other sports, but without the pathways and support of government. Participant 3 played for over 10 years, which is significant. The culture of derby attracted her. She'd previously been in a sport with strict rules about sock colour, bra colour, and minor things like this, which frustrated her. Derby gave her the ability to be an athlete and have a personality. But she found it was not welcoming for families. She would be called a breeder by others under their breath. Participant 4 really embraced the contact element. She said, I just wanted to hit people. She said, roller derby was the best way for me to release my stress. She really enjoyed the physical contact aspect. She said she was tired. She had left her husband. Roller derby taught her a lot about herself. She said it set her life on fire. Derby made her appreciate her body. Roller derby made her realize she was bisexual. She had never known that about herself before. She liked the contact because it made her feel powerful, and it came at a time when she was feeling very powerless, and she needed it at that time. She said it was a really awesome time of her life, but it was a separate chapter. Participant 5 was a nurse and notes that there were a lot of nurses and health workers in her league, and that actually comes up a lot in different leagues. She found it was a good way to fill her cup back up and recharge, and didn't find giving or receiving hits intimidating. She became a leader and enjoyed that role, though the politics became too much and she left. She has some regrets about leaving. Participant 6 talked about the illusion of belonging, but the reality of exclusion and not feeling like she was a part of it. She also talked about changes to rules and gameplay, stating, it's not the game I used to play. She loved the physicality, getting aggression out. She really enjoyed that. but the politics became too much, trying to become a more serious sport. Participant 7 talked about the way she liked getting hurt and the bruises, doing something completely out of the ordinary. Getting hurt was about feeling powerful, and she'd never played an organized sport before. Participant 8 likes the look, the association, the pin-up girl look, kick-ass feminist attitude, that sort of stuff. Though things didn't work out for her long term. For the short time she was there, it became a big part of her identity, doing crafts, getting into the mechanics. She said it was a good new start. She moved to a new place, broke up with her boyfriend, something good at the time, trying to find her people. But she found it very cliquey, cultish, and also felt targeted on the track. Participant 9 was one from the US, and she started out in junior roller derby, which was co-ed. It was the first and only sport she had played, and she said it was like a family. She said, once you're a player, you're always a player. It will always be in my heart. Participant 10 said when she started, it was made clear that it was all in or nothing. It was the closeness with other women that she enjoyed that she didn't get anywhere else. It fulfilled a part of her soul that couldn't be filled. Also, she talked about her queer identity. She was bi, married to a guy, and had a lot of desire for women at the time. The physical proximity to women was what she really wanted. She says she genuinely thinks that she found herself through roller derby, though she didn't necessarily skate for long. Participant 11 moved out of home, and roller derby was something she really wanted to do, something that signified a new independent chapter. She was a leader, helped to write policy. She played derby with the guys, but she didn't like it, felt really intense, and was more about brute force. Again, she said it had to be all in. It was hard work. She said she'd lost a lot of weight and got really fit and had personal fans too. Participant 12 played for a long time, played in both Australia and the US. She enjoyed the contact and aggression, felt like a space where it was the opposite of netball. She said that the strength and weakness was the same thing. The grassroots DIY ethos was what attracted people, but it was also hard to sustain. The burnout question was the key one. So many people left completely burnt out. Some came back, but a lot didn't. And there were a lot, and they were the people driving things. So Simone Fullagar, who's here today, writes that the psychologically empowering or biochemically enhancing processes of exercise, identified in numerous studies, but certainly not all, positions the social cultural as a background against which natural biopsychomechanisms are foregrounded. Questions concerning the co-implicated relations of embodied matter and social context cannot be asked within a naturalistic science paradigm as they evoke the excluded. Even when social sport is acknowledged in shaping exercise behavior, it's often positioned as an aspect of the individual, one's social psychology. So the question remains as how to account for the social in regards to mental health and well-being. How to account for the social in roller derby when for so many, the politics became untenable in the longer term. In particular, there's a gendered social dimension made explicit in roller derby. You see, much contemporary research continues to argue that girls and women are more social and less competitive than men and boys. This stereotyping of girls and women as, I guess you could say, nicer, has interesting affects and effects in that it provides justification for gender inequality, arguing that women and girls are just not cut out for certain kinds of work or leisure. At this point, I just wanted to also remind everybody of the structural and enduring inequality for women around the world, as well as experiences of trauma, including violence and sexual harassment. And although we didn't talk specifically about that, these kind of issues did come up in all of the interviews. So, you know, having an all-women sport, there are going to be a number of issues that the women are working through. And so I argue that roller derby can be conceived of in the Deleuzian sense as a milieu, an opening, an invitation to transformations, an invitation to take up, embrace, express, lay bare a troubled subjectivity, and in doing so, make a claim, take ownership of a form of gendered embodiment uncoupled from nurturing/caring subjectivities. This is not unproblematic, as the effective power relations at play became untenable for many involved and they left the sport. However, their experience was important in future subjectivities, in showing them what they could be, what they wanted or didn't want to be, and so forth. Roller derby is not about fixing a person, but about embracing those aspects potentially seen as broken, but not really. Not one person came to roller derby to lose weight, though some did. So do derby skaters have a rebellious streak, or perhaps a rational and clear questioning of arbitrary rules, such as bra colour in sport or sexuality, or women not being competitive? By troubled, I mean complicated, complex, multiple, non-normative, changing, fluid, surviving, traumatized, challenging. In providing space for the generation, enactment, or creation of a troubled derby subjectivity, the sport may enable a mode of becoming and being and relating that cannot be found in many other places. Because roller derby allows even total beginners to take up this subject position, there's an opportunity for fairly quick transformation. For some, they only skated for a year or so, but the experience helped them clarify a sense of who they were and where they wanted to belong, all important for well-being. For others, it initiated a sense of their physicality, and exercise became a bigger part of their lives. One of the questions I think is worth asking is this: what types of worlds might we live in where women's participation in aggressive contact sport is encouraged, supported, and accepted, and where notions of feminine fragility and vulnerability cease to exist as barriers to women's experiences of aggression and competitiveness in sport? Aggression, violence, and competition together describe some of the worst aspects of social life, yet their power or force is sometimes required to break through or free from certain entanglements or situations. An example: one does not simply leave a domestic violent relationship. Instead, a person must muster up every inch of their courage, tenacity, and resources to make that break. For women in particular, being nice has been hugely part of their psyche. Yet being nice was not simply being kind or compassionate, but at times being self-sacrificing, allowing people to treat one, us, them, as secondary citizens, loading them with labor, physical, cultural, social, emotional, and wondering why they weren't smiling more. In most general senses, the relation between care, competitiveness, and aggression is antithetical. Yet this paper has begun to show the gendered aspects of competitiveness and aggression in relation to care for the self, and by extension others, and the way this has useful and productive effects for their own subjectivities. One of the aims of this work has been to think holistically about care and be curious about the associations we make about care and how this affects how we care and who and what we care for. Judith Butler's political strategy of unharming the harm resonates with research across disciplines, which finds that aggression helps people recover from trauma. These multidisciplinary ideas provide starting points for exploring the relations between care, competitiveness, and aggression in sport, and in doing so, opening up the possibility for future transformations to gender relations and healing trauma. To end, I wanted to reiterate a few points. Namely, this notion of troubled derby subjectivities, and acknowledgement to Simone for helping me find that, as a kind of antidote to positivity culture that disallows angst and strong effects, particularly for women, and how taking up these troubled derby subjectivities has well-being effects on women who played beyond the sporting field. Although these women may no longer be meeting physical activity guidelines, though many still are, as the sport encouraged them to find other activities they liked, these women have a clear sense of what they want, of the power relations of spaces like derby, and how they respond to these kind of politics, and they have a strong sense of their body's capacity for strength and harm, and I would argue healing. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Adele. That was great. I really like research that shows things like subcultures and scenes aren't these kind of unified spaces that they're often presented as, and show there's a kind of struggles and stuff going on within them. I really enjoyed that. So we have time for one question, and I'll ask the one from David Ferrugia. So his question is, I have a question about the distinct kinds of micropolitics at play in a sport that consciously positions itself as progressive on issues connected to gender and sexuality. What are the normativities that shape the kinds of political inclusions and exclusions that these participants describe? So I suppose, what are some of the specific things, you know, there was a few quotes there about about the politics. Can you kind of maybe reflect on some of the actual examples of what those issues might be?
I think it's just, you know, so much part of it is this micro politics. And Fletcher, who writes about men in roller derby, you know, talks about skill capital, but it's so much more than that. From my experience and interviewing these people, some of these were unbelievable skaters, and yet they still felt this push of the politics. So, and racism is an issue in roller derby, which I think in many sports it is. And I'm not, you know, for a sport, it's probably doing more than most sports do in addressing it and being very open in trying to, though they get it wrong often. So there are issues around racism. There, you know, there's all different, there's so many different alliances, and there's age, and there's skill, there's sexuality, there's different kind of groups and cliques that form. And I think it's just the DIY ethos, because they're trying to be very inclusionary. It's just a real challenge, you know. And at the same time, they're supposed to have this DIY cooperative venture. They're also pretty keen on winning and improving and being tough and being strong. I mean, the Victorian team's been #1 in the world, right? So it's this real tension between cooperation and competition that roller derby, I guess, embodies.
Excellent. Thanks, Adele. So we might be able to come back and ask some other questions to Adele at the end. And we'll move on to our third paper now. So our third presenter is Mikko Piispa from the University of Helsinki, who's also part of the Finnish Youth Research Network. And he's going to talk about lifestyle sports, well-being, and doing otherwise. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I'm sharing at the moment, hopefully. Yeah, so thank you. Good day, everyone. My talk of today is indeed headlined Lifestyle Sports, Wellbeing and Doing Otherwise. Lifestyle sports have been a long-lasting subject of interest for me in doing research, and this talk of today is based on two different projects. One is on elite athletes and young artists, so-called Exceptional Life Courses project, conducted with Mikko Salasua and company, where also practitioners of multiple lifestyle sports were interviewed. Especially I draw from an article in Finnish translated as Youth Cultures and Politics of Sports and Arts, which is accepted at the moment and due to be published soon. I won't concentrate on the art part this time, although it is of interest, of course, too. Other study I draw from relates to my PhD thesis, where I've collected interview data on Finnish surfers and have a handful of papers in different phases of analysis at the moment. As for studying lifestyle sports, many features of them are probably familiar to most of you, but most importantly, they are often referred to as alternative from mainstream sports or established sports. Belinda Wheaton defines lifestyle sports as individualistic, youthful, non-aggressive, resistant to regulation and institutionalization, risk and hedonism oriented, and critical of or ambiguous about competition. They are more about doing it than the pursuit of competitive success. Many surfers, for example, emphasize the experience, feelingness connected to nature and the stoke of surfing, downplaying or being different towards competing. Though for many others, competition is an integral part of surfing, and it is often an aggressive practice. Nevertheless, as the term lifestyle sport suggests, surfing is not a mere hobby for its practitioners, but a whole lifestyle. There's a lot of previous research on the subject for anyone interested in delving deeper into it. There's just a few references down there. But as for my studies, I start on what the established fields of sports look like from the viewpoint of doing politics. Traditionally, politicking or even taking a stance has been banned for athletes during their active careers. While this may be going through a period of change, and I'm referring to the kneelings in North American sports and so on, the apoliticization has been the status quo for long. And I'm sure all of us can think of examples on how someone from the world of sports declares that politics do not belong to sports. This apoliticization, however, is not just a result of orders coming from above. Athletes usually devote themselves to strict training and competition schedules and commit themselves to a system that hardly acknowledges them as anything else but athletes. They are commodified, and traditionally athletes are not supposed to bite the hand that feeds them. Indeed, athletes devote to athletic agency, which often excludes societal agency. One significant downside of this comes when an athlete quits active career. When someone has solely devoted to being an athlete and winning, the normal life and partaking in societal activities or normal life altogether may feel strange or dull. There are multiple stories and studies on how this is a very difficult period, which sometimes results in mental health problems or destructive habits, or just plainly a sense of loss of direction in life. When in traditional sports, politicking has been a taboo, in lifestyle sports it is less so. Some lifestyle sports or their practitioners are almost political at core. More common, however, is that lifestyle sport just offers a way to do things differently. I already referred to how they provide a framework to do sports differently under different sets of rules, which are typically defined by the young partakers themselves and not the institutions. In terminology of Pierre Bourdieu, this could be seen as creating an own field instead of submitting to an existing field. And this subtly politicizes the traditional fields of sports too, like when stating that a competition does not matter or that we can express our views without institutional permissions. The rules of these new fields of lifestyle sports may be in some aspects looser, as in the idea that anyone can participate, but also in some aspects stricter, for example, demanding certain codes of conduct and respect. Nevertheless, there are other, perhaps more profound differences. Life altogether is often organized differently. It is typically guided by a different kind of agency. So if we talk about well-being, here we can already see that lifestyle sports have elements that might better enhance well-being of the practitioners when compared to traditional sports. This doesn't mean that there would not exist divisive, competitive and excluding elements, many of which Adol just addressed. But in principle, lifestyle sports accommodate for more social leeway, so to speak. And this is somewhat of a generalization, but it could be argued that among lifestyle sports, one can more easily find what Ferdinand Tönnies coined as Gemeinschaft, or sense of community, as a rough translation. And even if we did accept the fact that there are more and more elements in lifestyle sports that resemble established sports, as we can see with the inclusions of boy sports in the Olympics, a strong culture of dismissing the competitiveness and institutionalization still exists. One of my favorite examples is that when I interviewed an Olympic medalist and asked, how did you become an elite athlete? This guy responded laughing that I still don't regard myself as an elite athlete. One important aspect that relates to well-being is that in our data we found that practitioners of lifestyle sports, even at the very top of their career, often combine some other activities to the actual sporting. Many worked part-time with the sport they loved and thus intrinsically prepared for a career after the retirement from the active sports. Here the lifestyle sports indeed become a potentially lifelong lifestyle, which maintains them afloat also after the active career. Moreover, many related that this was a way they maintain a fresh touch to their hobby, and it won't become a necessity, dull, or full-time commitment, and they less have to obey any institutional limitations. Returning to politicization, street skateboarding has been regarded as a highly democratic form of sports or activity, as it can be practiced in principle everywhere. Another example could be parkour, of course. It's not that these lifestyle sports don't face opposition or limitations, but especially skateboarders have been active in asking to who does the public space belong to. Another less outspoken aspect of politicization is the mere existence of skateboarding. In Finland, scholar Anni Rannikko has referred to politics of noise, where noise and taking over the streets politicizes and challenges status quo. This has resulted in some concessions too, and perhaps skate parks are one form of gains, a compromise and an acknowledgement that this is what moves young people about and what they enjoy. Then I move on to surfers. Surfers are often referred to as a bit of outsiders or who are carving their own path, etc. And this discourse is definitely enhanced by the surfers themselves, but also the surf media and advertising in general, which tends to use surfers to sell a certain kind of lifestyle and imagery. While the notion of soul surfer, the classic vagabond in search of waves and leaving behind the ordinary life, is still the epitome of surfer for many, by becoming more popular and mainstream, surfing has maybe lost some of its shine. And now that it will be an Olympic sport too, it's becoming more and more assimilated, and for some more competitive too. I would still argue, based on my study on Finnish surfers, that for many, surfing lifestyle is not just a different kind of a hobby, but a practice that for many becomes something that defines their whole lifestyle. In Finland, this is accentuated by the fact that surfing often involves overseas traveling for long periods of time, as there are not many surfable waves here. This leads to a lifestyle where many conventions of normal life course become impossible, and life revolves around surfing and travels to reach it. To make a living, surfers often do something related to surfing, not just work part-time or flexible jobs. Again, it can be observed that surfing as a lifestyle sport challenges the conventions of doing the things traditional way. Here it's not just doing sports differently, but living differently. This again may not be outspokenly political, often to the contrary, as surfers may just want to do their thing in all the quiet and not get into arguments on if they are slackers or whatever. But their existence quietly highlights that there are different ways to do things. Many emphasize that this has had some influence on people around them to start with, and that the younger generations are altogether more open to these alternative ways to live life. And often they emphasize how status and career and salary, not even permanent relationships, these things don't matter to them that much. So it's truly a different kind of way to approach the whole life course. So moving on to well-being, existing literature has well demonstrated that surfing, while also being a dangerous and risky and life-threatening sport, can enhance physical and mental well-being with people who practice it, independent of their level of skills. And many surfers will go on to emphasize this too, definitely. There are elements of exclusion, territorialism, even violence, localism, which shouldn't be downplayed either. But what I'm interested in is to analyze how surfing, surf community and surf culture provides ways for social well-being, and especially here in the somewhat peculiar Finnish surfing scene. Surfers in Finland, not only do they travel a lot, at least until the COVID pandemic, they often, by traveling, they are often on other surfers' shores not on their home turf. This often results in less localism, less aggressiveness, and gravitating towards inclusive and cosmopolitan aspects of surf. Surf community, like globally, is regarded as friendly and a social context for belonging and comradeship. Many surfers indeed emphasize being cosmopolitan, how they have met friends when traveling, how they have got to know the localities and people who live there, and emphasize on the good, on the value of travel and meeting other people. Some Finnish surfers, though, prefer to surf in Finland, which again is peculiar. The waves here are hardly ever of world class, well, never, and on the contrary, they are often choppy and messy. Nevertheless, for some, it is exactly this that is of interest, to take what is given and create a special kind of a group that enjoys the rough and tough härmäsurf, how it is often referred to as, and the small social circles and conventions around it. Many emphasize that they don't need others to understand why on earth would someone go surfing on to icy waters on a stormy November morning, 7 a.m. But this is not something to be shared with everyone or shouted to everyone. On the contrary, they prefer to keep it low key and inside their own social circles. Altogether, it seems the Finnish surf and surf community leaves room for multiple approaches to surfing and ways to make life more meaningful. I hope I'll be able to look into these interconnections and combinations of cosmopolitan versus local values and practices in near future research, as the COVID pandemic has indeed restricted travel, and who knows if ever the surfers will again be free to travel as they used to. Thus, many are now practicing surfing here locally, or relatively locally here, not maybe Finland or the neighboring countries, and what happens to the cosmopolitan aspects, or what happens to the local social circles here? Do they become more intimate or whatever? This would be a very highly interesting subject for future research, or near future research, which I hope I'll be able to do soon. Well, in any case, I argue that lifestyle sports are not just the way to do sports. Otherwise, that they often emphasize ways that differ from how life should be lived, and this politicization is an important aspect of it, as it creates possibilities for more political participation and this kind of societal membership compared to traditional sports. And a recent case, if here, for example, I would like to address, as at the moment I'm studying also youth climate activism, and just a few weeks ago there was a big news in Finland how this promising triple jumper, young triple jumper, quit her career and in order to participate fully in Extinction Rebellion movement, which is I think is revealing of how limiting the traditional sports can be. Well, in any case, I would love to hear your thoughts on these issues, especially if you have something to comment on the work in progress on surfer identities and well-being. That would be lovely to hear. As many of you are probably from Australia, country famed for its surf, it would be many of you probably would have some valuable comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So, but that's it, and on to the discussion. I thank you warmly for being able to participate.
Thanks, Miko. That was great. So I'll do the same thing I did with other papers. I'll just ask a quick question first, and then we might move on to some general discussion. So the first couple of questions that were in the chat, there was one about professionalisation, and another kind of follow-up question, I suppose, that was also about the micropolitics similar to Adele's paper. So I was wondering if you could just quickly reflect on the professionalisation process that surfing has gone through, you know, like many sports have in the past, and what your respondents say about that. And maybe, you know, if that relates to, or if there's other kind of forms of micropolitics in the sport that people struggle over that isn't just about kind of, you know, the violence of being a local or whatever that happens so much at Australian beaches or whatever.
Yeah, well, in the interviews we discussed like the mainstreaming of, or like the surfing becoming more competitive and mainstream, and I conducted the interviews back in 2016 and 17, and I think back then it was already clear that surfing was becoming Olympic sport, if I remember correctly. And many of them, of course, emphasize that they are not really professional surfers in Finland. That officially speaking, there has been one Finnish professional back in 90s or so, and some of them are semi-professionals, like in a way that they are not making money by surfing, but by carving surfboards and so on. So I think the Finnish surfers, that's one big reason that the Finnish surfers gravitate towards the kind of the soul surfer imagery and this romanticized take on surfing. And many were kind of many described how they didn't feel comfortable when surfing in California or Australia, where there's a lot of competitiveness, and they prefer to go to more quiet places or and so on. So yeah, I don't know if this answered the question, and I kind of forgot it, but hopefully, yeah.
Well, a follow-up question that's coming up a little bit too is, do you have any reflections on the gender balance and the kind of attitudes towards gender in Finnish surfing? Do you think it's more or less sexist than surfing cultures elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Among my 20 interviewees, 9 were female. So it wasn't really hard to find women for the interviews. And what I've understood that the girls and women have been taken upon surfing even more after the conducting the interviews, like during the last couple of years. Just last weekend there was this Finnish, it's really unofficial, but this Finnish championship surf competition, which is really kind of how do you say, like really relaxed event, and just mostly for having fun and so on. And there's the for series for men, and then there's one for female, and I think the female league or whatever, it had more partakers even. So it's really, I don't know if it's 50-50, but in any case, that kind of it's reflected upon the attitudes and the cultural atmosphere here. So I think it's really like inclusive and non-sexist, and at least how I've understood it. Like, and the women who I interviewed often addressed how they've been welcomed to the surfer community as surfers, not as women. They were. They didn't criticize the Finnish community, but they did mention meeting sexist attitudes when traveling, of course.
Okay, thanks for that answer. And if anyone has a follow-up question about that topic, can you please put in the chat? So if I can get all our speakers now to turn on their mics and cameras again, and we can ask some more general stuff. And I've made a note of some of the earlier questions. If anyone has any others, please put them in the chat, or maybe even turn your camera on, and I can come to you to get you to ask it. So I'll just go back a little bit. So for the first paper, Paris asked, was there anything about that came up with the young musicians on shutdown? Was there anything about a kind of lack of governmental support or funding that happened or didn't happen, I suppose, at that time?
Yeah, thank you. I actually made a note of that because it was an interesting point. Was that one of the things participants spoke about was how they felt they were perceived and valued as musicians. And a number of them spoke about this idea that in COVID, everyone's turned to the arts, including music. And, that proves the social value of these things. And that went alongside comments about a lack of government support for arts workers. But it also fed into this sort of positive self-identity as a musician who's doing something worthwhile. And I think actually under the theme of purpose that we had, there's a subcategory of service that was actually a thing that came up with people saying, I have value as a musician, and that's a part of their well-being.
Okay. Other members of the paper want to say anything about that? Or any of the other panel members?
I mean, just generally, I suppose it's always a thing, isn't it, about government support, but I suppose the way that COVID has kind of rolled out, music and young people has been one of the last things I think on government agendas, broadly defined, really, sadly.
Okay, and another question about your paper is from Julia Coffey, who wrote, your findings on music and feelings is really rich in terms of embodied and physical sensations, relating music, well-being, catharsis, and things like that. A way of working through feelings has been productive and literally coping with well-being. She's wondering how you see the significance of this in kind of broader context of your study and maybe broader understandings of well-being.
I wonder if I could jump in again with something about how that came out in the interviews, and then maybe Andy or Anesta could build on that. So I guess one of the questions we're interested in is why music? Any hobby is partly a source of well-being, but they have differences, like Adele said about the physicality of roller derby maybe. And making music is different from listening in some ways. And so in the interviews about this, that all that detail about embodied experience came out, about what it is that music making specifically offers. What's the experience of music? And so that was where all that detail came out. And I appreciated that because I think that that does give some clues for how to talk about what's special about music in particular, as opposed to other things which surely offer other benefits. And anything from my partners on that?
And Esther, do you have anything to add to that health perspective?
Thanks, Andy. Not really, actually, at the moment. I think what Ben was saying is really all the very important aspects. And I think overall during, I guess this is what I could add, in terms of COVID-19 pandemic, I think we really, in terms of health, it's a huge focus on all the negatives.
Someone turn their mic off, please. Sorry, yeah.
Wait, I think it's actually my husband. I'm going to tell him to be quiet.
Sorry, I interrupted you there.
Dinner is coming. I think the importance overall is during this pandemic, there's lots of, this focus on negative sides of it. And of course, it's a crisis that we're experiencing, but I think there's definitely less focus on the positive things and how people deal with the changed reality that's happening today. So I think that's the key contribution to understand how and in what way what do people do to cope with these situations in a very positive way.
Okay.
Yeah, and I suppose just to add to that, I think it's been an interesting exercise in just, seeing how people young people self-enable, just using the kind of stuff that they've got to hand, really. And the thing about youth and music is the research has been going for a long time, but as I said at the beginning of the paper, a lot of it, I think, has been in the realms of things like, if you're looking at music and well-being, it's music therapy or it's music and education. And there's nothing wrong with those things, but it overlooks the fact that young people can actually, you know, enable themselves through using skills which are easily accessible to a lot of them, you know, and that's something I think which we've seen here. And it was interesting as well, if I could just say one other thing about it, that when we first put the call out, we said we wanted 18 to 35-year-olds, and we had a lot of, well, not a lot of, but some musicians older than that who got a bit antagonistic and said, well, what about us? You know, are you not interested in what we've got to say? And, you know, yes, we are, but it's a different project, really. I think we were just looking at this kind of thing that is not usually acknowledged, which is the way that young people can, you know, self-resource to some extent with music and other creative pursuits.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Next question is for Adele. Ben asks, is the anti-breeder sentiment broad, and does it feed into the way parents are provided for in sport, such as scheduling and facilities and things like that? This is something that he's found in his research around alternative music that's come a long way in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I'm not sure, you know, how broad it is. I think every league has a particular culture, but it's certainly not, you know, necessarily for mothers, though it's for women. I think gender is a lot more open, and also finding venues is really challenging in roller derby. It's an ongoing challenge for lots of leagues, so it's probably not necessarily a high priority, having particular facilities, because you need a type of track and indoor and things like that. So yeah, I guess it's a space where you, like I said, is uncoupled from this kind of caring, nurturing subjectivity. So, but then that makes it difficult if people don't have care. Some people would bring their children to training, and that was okay, but they weren't doted on or anything. Whereas maybe in other sports, people might, you know, it might be different. But yeah.
Yep. Okay. Okay, so there's a new question from Megan Sharp. It's about DIY, how kind of, I suppose there was kind of DIY elements across all of the papers. So she's curious about how participants of these studies understand DIY. Is it anti-capitalist? Is it anti-establishment? Political, ethical alignment? Or is it purely in relation to money resistance, not having corporate backing and things like that?
Such a good question.
How do the young people conceptualize DIY as a thing?
I mean, I just wanted to say how central it was in roller derby. You know, I even went to Beijing, and the key thing that they loved about roller derby was this DIY. You know, they said, oh, you know, because it's all by the skater, for the skater, and they really emphasized that, just doing it themselves, not having those. I think there's a kind of association between sports governing bodies and being a particular kind of subjectivity that they wanted to rail against. But sometimes the DIY aspects don't have a necessarily political, ethical alignment. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but in roller derby, it was more about resistance to incorporation. And there's a great paper about skateboarding by Lombard that, you know, so the ways that resistance to incorporation shapes the sport in a particular way. Yeah, it's definitely a really important aspect, but I'll let other panelists also comment.
Miko, do you have a comment on that?
I think there's a strong individualistic take on it. Like the people, like the surfers often emphasize that they want to do their kind of lifestyle. They, even though they are not professional surfers, far from it, but they kind of dismiss the career and education and those kind of things and prefer to surf travel. And that's they often argue that this is what I want to do, and it's it's not, there might be this anti-capitalist undertow, like for many, and some this is stronger, and for some this, and for some this is non-existent. But the main thing is to do, like, live your life as you want to live it, and I think the same goes pretty much to the other lifestyle sports professionals or semi-professionals we interviewed in the other project. So yeah, I think there's strong individualism there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if I could just again extend on that, I think the DIY concept has become a sort of a nexus culture, if you can call it that. So, as some of you know, I co-convene a conference every 2 years in Portugal, or at least I did do until they shut the world down, which was on do-it-yourself cultures. And it's a very broad-based thing, and you get people coming from all over the place. I think we've had every continent now except Africa, and we might have even had someone from Africa actually the last time around. And someone asked a really important question of one of the keynotes. It's one of the conference questions that just stays in my mind, which is, does punk still have to be punk to be punk? And I thought that was an amazing kind of observation, because, you know, punk is a kind of an endemic culture, really, you know, within the kind of sphere of all kinds of musics now. You can hear it in EDM, you can hear it in rap, you can hear it in reggae, you know, which reggae was the other arm of the original UK punk thing when it first appeared. You see it in skater culture, surfer culture, you know, it's not completely there, but it wouldn't be the same without it. And I think it's exactly, DIY as an extension of punk has become this thing which people breathe their own life into it, but when they get together as a, you know, like a collective conscience, it's there, you know, it's just part of it. So people bring all kinds of different meanings to DIY, and I don't think it would be what it is without any of those things as part of it.
Yeah. DIY's been something that's been co-opted, right? Like Bunnings is DIY now, so it does have really different meanings across all those spaces. Yeah. Okay. There's Paris's made a comment here that I suppose might be a good segue to something I wanted for you all to comment upon. So it says, like, feels like the well-being aspect is connected to rituals and communities of practice, and this is for all three papers and the objects that you were studying. And the pandemic has disrupted the ability of people to come together, to make music, to roller derby, to surf together. And I know the music project, you know, takes into account COVID, but can I get you all just to quickly reflect on what COVID's going to mean for these practices? Do you want to go first, Mikko? Yeah.
Yeah, I can. The Finnish context is peculiar in the way that the lockdown here for the first few months was pretty heavy, but the summer was. There were a couple of months that you could go on hardly remembering that the COVID existed. Of course, the borders were, like, traveling was restricted and so on, but young people gathered almost as they used to do, and surfers, instead of traveling overseas, now surfed in Finland or went to Norway or Estonia and so on. So the pandemic has disrupted some parts of the community, but then again, it has. I think probably it has kind of enhanced the local community here, as the people have still been able to go on surfing. And what I've heard, like in Spain, there were times, maybe still, that people can go to beaches, they can go surfing without wearing a mask, which, you know, it's undoable probably. Yeah. So
goggle and snorkel.
Yeah, so in Finland that has not been the case. So the pandemic has been softer on it, but then again, it has changed the landscape of the community.
Okay. What about for roller derby, Adele?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question for people that are currently participating. You know, so I'm following a number of Instagram, and they're they're posting supportive things and they can't wait to get together again. But for the participants that I interviewed that had left, the well-being aspect was connected to maybe the disruption that roller derby provided, not just the community. Sometimes it was the conflict that supported the well-being or the break from a different kind of subjectivity and allowed them to continue to become not a static notion of being or well-being, but becoming.
Okay, excellent. And for the music kind of scenes and subcultures, I know, like, I suppose there's been, you know, Isolate and all these other kind of efforts to move, you know, formerly live interactions to digital interactions. Do you guys have something to say about it as well?
Ben, what do you think?
I guess coming off that discussion of the, you know, the embodied experience of music and what type of experience are people looking for in it, I've, in other research, and I know Andy has too, looked at what not just music makers, but all the other people who participate in music scenes are looking for. And it is a certain experience. And I guess what's coming out of our research is that there are, you know, online ways of watching performances and of monetizing music and these sorts of things. But the sort of, to a large extent, music is still organized around this live experience, which involves all sorts of things you're just not allowed to do at the moment. In fact, you know, whenever it comes up in political discussion, when the Queensland Premier comes out and says what you're allowed to do, she actually laughed when the topic of dancing came up. Like, no, you can't dance.
Yep.
So I think, like Mikko pointed out, even when it returns, it'll be a very long process and a reinvention. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, look, I see old concert footage now, like a year old, of people like in moshes going over each other, and you kind of cringe at it because it's just completely changed the orientation towards people rubbing up against each other in public space. Yeah. Okay, if I can maybe ask the last question. I've over the past couple of years been really interested in the kind of co-optation of things like well-being and happiness and things like that. So there's like all these really good books about it, Manufacturing Happy Citizens and the happiness industry and all this kind of stuff. So I was just wondering if you guys across the papers could maybe critically reflect on what well-being means now that it's kind of, you know, it is kind of like DIY in a way, a kind of marketing term that's used across a whole bunch of different spaces.
Well, if I could just start off, I mean, that's my anxiety about the whole trip of music getting co-opted, you know, into these kind of structured environments where you write a song and then you feel good about it, and then you go away and you tell your friends and they write a song. You know, it seems it's a sort of nice concept, but I think the actual well-being as a source of things is often more individual. You know, it's like productive aging, you know, it's like a great concept, but what does it actually mean? You know, it's very much down to the individual to define what that means. So I think music is, at least for those people, and it's not just music makers, it's people who listen to music, it's people who, dare I say, dance to music. You know, they are the people who can decide how it helps them to enhance their lives. And I think right now it's a critical moment for that. So.
Yeah. And Esther, you wrote there that it's a process. Can you maybe say a little bit on that?
I think that links back to, you know, as I mentioned before, that defining what is well-being is really, really difficult. And it means a lot of things, but I think the key thing here is that it is a very dynamic process rather than a state that we can achieve and then we are happy and well. That kind of reminded me, you know, lots of these self-help books that this is what you need to do and then you will be happy and well, but it is a process. And that, you know, links back to, you know, we are very much dependent with our interactions with the self as well as interactions with others, interactions with our environment, be it physical environment or broader, you know, socioeconomic structures or contexts like pandemics. So I think that's a very important aspect of well-being that needs to be considered, which often, at least in health literature, it's often forgotten, and we're looking at measuring this quite static states of, you know, the magic pill that one could take and suddenly be happy and well.
Yep. Adele, do you want to have the last word on well-being?
Awesome, thanks. Cool. No, I guess I sometimes well-being, how useful is it? But I've been thinking a lot about healing more so, rather than this idea of well-being, being positive, being happy. You know, we know that as a society, as a culture, there's been a lot of trauma, and that we can collectively think about healing and supporting people through that. So I just wanted to add.
Okay, that's a nice positive way to finish up. So we're running out, we're past the time we're meant to go to, so I think I might pull it up there. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers. It's been a really good session, and thanks to everyone that came along. That's been great, so thanks very much. Yep, claps from everyone. And please, everyone that came along today, look out. We'll be holding hopefully another 4 of these towards, you know, throughout the rest of the year. And so please come along to them as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.